There's been a lot of fascination in the past couple of decades with an Indian practice called Tantra, which comes originally from the yoga tradition and has been, well, let's say, usurped by other cultures who have applied the name Tantra and, in principle, some of the practices. But as a practical matter, this oral tradition that was communicated in India from about 500 to about 1500 AD is one that has a lot more complexity and a lot more nuance than it's been given in modern times and in the Western world, and even, I understand, in India. So I'm endeavoring to present a series on some of the aspects that come from the original tradition of Tantra and represent a set of spiritual practices which have a specific design, a specific intent, and most importantly, I think, an ability to start to give us some freedom in our lives, some meaning, maybe some answers that have been elusive for a lot of us in modern times. Hi, I'm Steve from Steve White Yoga, bringing you the tools and deeper practices beyond the mat to manage your health, improve your relationships, and balance your life. Today, I'll give a brief introduction to a series on Tantra Yoga that I call Tantra Yoga Beginnings that's upcoming, and we'll begin to explore some of the basic practices along with the fundamental principles associated with this fascinating ancient tradition that is so practical and applicable for somebody who's interested in modern life. Stay tuned. So the first thing to understand is what Tantra Yoga is. And a lot of people use the typical definition of the word Tantra, which is said to mean to weave. And the idea here is like weaving a piece of cloth or something, so that it's an integration of various yogic practices put together in a way that is cohesive and presents something for the practitioner that is useful. However, this isn't the way that Tantra is applied in the word Tantric Yoga, because Tantra here refers simply to the name of the texts that were associated with this set of practices. There are many branches of Tantric Yoga, some of which survived more intact into the modern era than others. But in essence, most Tantra relies on the single idea that we're trying to connect what they call macrocosm and microcosm. So microcosm is defined by this energy body that is me or you or anybody or thing else, anything that can be named, and connecting that with its source, with what's often called in the tradition as being consciousness or supreme consciousness, or our highest self suffices as well. Some people would call it God. So whatever word or terminology works for you, it's something that's really beyond definition, beyond cognition. But the idea is that we create over time through practice a relationship with our truest self, with our highest self. So the original Tantra, as began somewhere around 500 AD or maybe even a little before, was designed for the common person, the common man or woman in this case, which I think was new to the yoga world at that point, because up until then, spiritual practices were primarily designed for men. So this was available to anyone, regardless of their class, regardless of their status in society, regardless of their sex. It was based purely on the idea that anyone was eligible for a spiritual awakening. Now, it must be said that in the modern era, Tantra has really been appropriated, I guess is the right word. So beginning in the late 1800s, Westerners began to take interest in these practices and in some of the concepts and ideas surrounding them. And as a result of that, it was sort of imported, but not in its original condition at all. And in fact, most of what is represented today in the Western world as Tantra has very little to do with what they practiced in medieval India. Having said that, some of it did survive, and some of it that survived has been adapted because we're not medieval Indians. And in a modern audience, there have to be some allowances made for the fact that we live in a different time, come from a different perspective, have a different sensibilities. And so all of this plays into the fact that some modifications or adaptations have been made to virtually every tantric practice, even if it comes from the original tradition. So what can somebody expect to learn in this series on Tantra? The first is perspective. Better perspective, more informed, more enlightened perspective. Perspective that's freer of our typical sort of habits of responding out of our fears, out of our desires, out of our aversions. And secondly, it provides some kind of a pathway, at least the beginnings of a pathway, to begin a spiritual practice that can set you in a direction. And third, it provides some basic tools. And so we're going to focus on very much the preliminaries, but nonetheless very important and ultimately very powerful practices. So whether you have an existing yoga or meditation practice, or whether this is all brand new to you, you should get some value and be able to set yourself with practice on a course that is going to dramatically improve your life. So why does Tantra yoga matter? Why is it important? Why are we talking about it at all? Well, in a sense, we live in an age of confusion where traditional religions have sort of fallen off or been greatly altered, and where we don't necessarily act in the kind of cohesive way as communities, as a society, as a planet that maybe we did several hundred or several thousand years ago. And so with that loss of community, we've lost our voice, and by some reckonings, even lost our soul. We've lost our foundation, the foundation that we used to have that came from community, that came from a connection with nature, with earth, with the movement of the planets and the changing of the seasons. Much of that has been replaced by a massive communication system that operates primarily in sound bites and is, in many cases, anonymous, highly critical, baseless, sort of mindless rhetoric, and comes from a place very much of sort of knee-jerk reaction to whatever someone says or thinks or whatever is going on in any given moment in the world. And so from the tradition standpoint, we've sort of lost our way. Now, the good news is that the tantric practices can help to bring us back into alignment, first with ourselves, to establish a relationship with our own person, with who we are, to challenge our current notions of self-image, and to start to examine what it is we do on a daily basis and why it matters and how it may be damaging or dysfunctional to our overall sort of purpose in life. And that's the final reason for doing these practices, is that a new sense of purpose can arise out of all of this. And in fact, sort of in the highest sense, what Tantra is for is to create a relationship with ourselves, with our communities, with our planet, and with our sort of highest sense of self that is highly functional and workable and provides a lot more answers than it does questions. So, if this all appeals to you, then I invite you to join me for the coming weeks as we will drop probably in sets of 3 weeks in a row and then a break. We'll start to slowly explore what Tantra is, how it can function in our lives, and what practices that we can do if we choose to commit to them in order to really better ourselves in our relationships. So, with that said, I invite you to subscribe, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below. Stay tuned for more practices from beyond the mat to manage your health, improve your relationships, and balance your life. Until later, I'm Steve White, and this is Steve White Yoga. Ciao.